The frozen wastes of Siberia, a discovery defies everything we thought we knew about human history. A military excavation unearths not just an ancient corpse, but something that shouldn't exist. A bronze mechanism with technology thousands of years beyond its time. As scientists study this impossible artifact, they notice something terrifying. It isn't just recording history, it's remembering it. Dr. Mikhail Voronov and cryptographer Claire Rowe race to understand the device as those who come in contact with it begin experiencing memories that aren't their own, ancient knowledge no living person should possess, visions that feel lived rather than learned. But the most disturbing question isn't what the artifact is, it's why someone buried it so deliberately in the first place. What happens when some memories were never meant to be preserved? The truth lies in a single frame of security footage. For exactly 2 minutes and 17 seconds, the corpse they discovered, a man dead for 13,000 years, turned its head to look directly at the camera. The frozen earth split with a sound like breaking bones. Dr. Mikhail Voronov flinched as the ground beneath the excavation site surrendered its grip, revealing a perfect circle of darkness against the Siberian permafrost. It wasn't the cold that made his hands tremble as he adjusted his headlamp. 20 years of field archaeology had taught him that the Earth never gives up its secrets willingly. The military helicopter hovered above, its rhythmic thudding a counterpoint to the hollow wind sweeping across the tundra. The pilot's voice crackled through the radio, asking for a status update, but Voronov ignored it. His attention was fixed on the aperture now fully exposed by his team's careful work, a shaft descending into darkness that shouldn't exist in this geological layer. "Temperature's rising," muttered Anna, the team's geologist, studying her instruments with furrowed brows. "The cavity is 2 degrees warmer than the surrounding permafrost." Voronov nodded absently, lowering himself into the opening. The shaft was unnaturally smooth, as if carved by tools rather than formed by natural processes. Impossible at this depth, his lamp illuminated ancient ice nearly translucent, preserving a timeline of Earth's history like pages in a forgotten book. The radio sparked to life. A scream, primal and raw, cut through the static. "Professor, you need to see this now." Voronov descended faster, following the voice to a small chamber where 3 of his colleagues stood motionless, their lights fixed on a single point. In the convergence of their beams lay a human form, locked in ice so clear it might have been glass. The body was contorted, folded in ways human anatomy shouldn't permit, as if compressed by some invisible force. But it was the face that caused Voronov's breath to catch in his throat. The corpse's empty eye sockets were fixed upward, mouth stretched in a silent scream. Despite millennia of entombment, the facial muscles remained perfectly preserved in an expression of absolute terror. Something had frightened this person beyond comprehension at the moment of death. "Carbon dating suggests this ice formed approximately 13,000 years ago," whispered Anna, her voice clinical, a scientist's defense against the horror before them. "That's well before any recorded civilization in this region." Voronov moved closer, and his light caught something else, a metallic gleam beside the body. Partially embedded in the ice wall was a disc, roughly the size of a dinner plate, made of what appeared to be bronze. Its surface was covered with intricate, precisely engineered gears and inscriptions that combined Sumerian cuneiform with archaic Greek and unfamiliar symbols. "That's impossible," he breathed. "These writing systems are separated by thousands of years." When he reached toward it, the disc emitted a low, almost imperceptible hum. The sound was felt more than heard, vibrating at a frequency that made the team's equipment flicker and their teeth ache. Voronov hesitated, then carefully pressed his gloved fingers to the bronze surface. A dry crack reverberated through the chamber like subterranean thunder. The ice around the disc fractured in a perfect circle, and the artifact fell into his hands. It was unexpectedly warm. In the containment laboratory of the Russian research base at Khatanga, scientists spoke in hushed tones as they examined the artifact under controlled conditions. The disc resembled the Antikythera mechanism in complexity, but predated it by millennia. Initial tests confirmed it was indeed bronze, with trace elements of a crystalline material found only in meteorite impacts. "It's storing energy," said Dr. Lena Petrov, running her scanner over the surface again. "Electromagnetic patterns unlike anything we've recorded before." General Baranov, the military observer, watched from the corner with narrowed eyes. "Is it a weapon?" "It's a key," Voronov replied, though he couldn't explain why he was so certain. "Or perhaps a lock." That night, as Arctic darkness engulfed the base, the security cameras captured something the human eye couldn't perceive. For precisely 2 minutes and 17 seconds, the body in cold storage turned its head 3 degrees toward the east, where the artifact was being kept. When the footage was reviewed the next morning, the technician who discovered it suffered a psychotic break, repeating one phrase over and over: "He exists inside time. Inside time." Voronov knew, with a certainty that transcended scientific reasoning, that what they had unearthed wasn't merely an archaeological discovery. It was a warning etched in bronze and human remains, something deliberately buried, not to be preserved but to be forgotten. The containment laboratory hummed with the low drone of monitoring equipment. 3 days had passed since the discovery, and the military had doubled security around the facility. Voronov stood before the artifact, now suspended in a specialized electromagnetic field. His reflection distorted across its bronze surface, a face stretched and compressed like the corpse they'd found. "It responds to specific wavelengths," he said, not turning as Claire Rowe entered the room. The British cryptographer had arrived that morning, summoned from Cambridge after preliminary analysis, revealed inscriptions that defied historical sequence. "So I've heard," she replied, her voice carrying the crisp precision of Oxford English. She placed her equipment case on the table with deliberate care. "General Baranov mentioned you've been here for 72 hours straight." Voronov didn't confirm or deny. Sleep felt dangerous now, filled with images he couldn't explain. Visions of hands crafting the artifact in firelight, of faces he'd never seen yet somehow recognized. Claire approached the disc, her gaze analytical. The engravings combine at least 3 distinct writing systems, separated by thousands of years. Her finger hovered above the surface without touching it. Sumerian cuneiform from 3000 BCE, archaic Greek elements, and these symbols. She frowned. "I've never seen these before in any historical record." "It's not a timepiece," Voronov said abruptly. "At least not in the conventional sense." He connected the artifact to an oscilloscope. The screen displayed a complex waveform that repeated precisely every 137 seconds. "Watch this pattern. It maintains perfect symmetry regardless of external stimuli." Claire leaned closer. "That's impossible. Even atomic clocks show variance." "Now, compare it to this." Voronov pulled up another waveform on a separate monitor. "This is an EEG reading, human brain activity during deep REM sleep." The patterns were unmistakably similar, almost identical in key segments. "You're suggesting it's—" "What, exactly?" Claire asked, her scientific skepticism battling visible unease. "I believe it maps neural patterns, stores them perhaps." Voronov ran a hand through his disheveled hair. "When exposed to an electromagnetic field matching human brain frequency, it emits a counter-frequency, like a conversation." They created a digital model of the artifact's structure, mapping every gear and inscription. As the simulation activated, their equipment began registering anomalous data, fragments of sound too structured to be random interference. "Is that language?" Claire adjusted the audio filters. Through the static came disconnected words in ancient Russian and Sumerian, forming what Claire recognized as fragments of lost prayers, words no living person should know. Voronov froze as the central display screen flickered. For a moment it showed an image that couldn't possibly exist, a reflection of himself, but not in the laboratory. In this vision, he stood in a stone chamber, trembling with fear, raising a rock to destroy the very artifact they were studying. Claire stopped the simulation, visibly shaken. On the screen appeared her name, Claire, embedded in the base of the artifact in characters impossible to falsify or misinterpret. "This doesn't make sense," she whispered. "My name shouldn't be there. It can't be there." Later that night, searching through archaeological records, they discovered something equally impossible. A fragment of identical bronze with similar inscriptions had been recovered in 1901, but vanished mysteriously from Moscow's Historical Museum 3 days after cataloguing. The curator who last handled it was found catatonic, unable to recognize his own reflection. Carbon dating confirmed the ice surrounding the artifact had formed approximately 13,000 years ago, millennia before the development of written language or complex metallurgy. The implications were staggering. Someone had created sophisticated technology before the advent of agriculture, and someone or something had gone to extraordinary lengths to ensure it remained buried. As they compiled their findings, neither scientist noticed that the security cameras in the laboratory had stopped recording at precisely 2:17 a.m., the exact duration of the artifact's electromagnetic cycle. Nor did they see that the artifact's central gear had rotated 1 full degree counterclockwise entirely on its own. Voronov stared at his reflection in the laboratory window, momentarily uncertain whether he was looking at himself or someone else. 4 days into the investigation, and simple things were slipping away. His mother's birthday, his home address, the color of his university office. Yet other memories, not his own, emerged with disturbing clarity. "You missed our briefing this morning," Claire said, entering the lab with 2 cups of coffee. Her voice carried concern beneath its professional tone. "Did I?" Voronov accepted the cup, his fingers trembling slightly. "I was elsewhere. You were here, actually. Sitting in that exact spot for 3 hours, according to security footage." She placed a tablet before him. "You wouldn't respond to anyone." The screen showed him unmoving, staring at the artifact with unfocused eyes. Voronov had no recollection of this. Instead, he remembered walking through a settlement of hide tents, watching people craft bronze using techniques lost to history. He remembered the weight of ceremonial robes he'd never worn, and the taste of fermented mare's milk he'd never drunk. "I think the artifact is leaking," he said finally, choosing his words with scientific precision despite the absurdity of the statement. Claire didn't dismiss him. She'd been experiencing it too. Fragments of knowledge she shouldn't possess surfacing in her translations. Yesterday she'd written a full paragraph in a dialect of Sumerian that scholars had only theoretical knowledge of, unable to explain how she knew the correct syntax. "It's storing memories somehow," she suggested, arranging her notes meticulously, a habit that grounded her when facts became fluid. Like a temporal sponge absorbing psychic fragments. But these memories appear to be infiltrating the living. The artifact had been moved to a specialized chamber lined with electromagnetic dampening material. Even isolated, it maintained its precise 137-second cycle. Their latest tests revealed that all computer models failed when attempting to recreate its function without including human neural activity as a variable. "It's not just storing information," Voronov said. "It's projecting perspectives, multiple consciousnesses." A military scientist had volunteered to connect more directly to the artifact's field. His vital signs had remained stable for precisely 137 seconds before he suffered cardiac arrest. His last recorded words, captured by the monitoring equipment, "I see myself seen by another." The ancients knew, Claire said, spreading out maps she'd discovered in Russia's National Library. The Katanga region appeared on Paleolithic migration charts, marked in various indigenous languages, with symbols translating to "forbidden land" or "sealed earth." The Evenki people called it the dreamer's machine, she continued, buried in ice to contain what should not be remembered by men. Voronov pressed his palms against his temples. "I keep seeing a circle. People standing around the artifact. They're not worshipping it, they're containing it." "What if it wasn't created?" Claire's voice dropped to nearly a whisper. "What if it was discovered, long before it was buried?" That night, Voronov dreamed of a civilization that understood time differently, not as a line, but as a field that could be harvested. In this dream, he watched engineers craft devices to capture consciousness itself, storing it like grain against some impending winter of the mind. He saw himself among them, but also watching them simultaneously creator and observer. He awoke to find he'd written equations across his bedroom wall in his sleep, mathematical formulas describing memory as a wave function that could be captured and transferred. The mathematics were beyond his training, incorporating principles he'd never studied. When he returned to the lab, Claire was already there, her eyes ringed with exhaustion. On her notepad were sketches identical to his equations. "I don't think we're studying this artifact," she said without preamble. "I think it's studying us." As if responding to her words, the facility's lights flickered in a pattern matching the artifact's frequency. For 137 seconds, every digital display showed the same image. A circle of people surrounding the bronze disc, their faces obscured except for their eyes, all turned outward, as if watching for something approaching from beyond the circle. Later that day, they received word that the Russian government had authorized transferring the artifact to a secure military research facility in Norilsk. Scientists there wanted to understand its properties, perhaps replicate them. The implications for memory-based technology were too significant to ignore regardless of risk. Neither Claire nor Voronov voiced their growing conviction that the artifact wasn't waiting to be understood, it was waiting to be remembered. And in being remembered, it would continue to exist regardless of what vessel carried its memory. The helicopter blades sliced through heavy snow as Claire and Voronov approached Sindasko, a near-abandoned village 70 kilometers from the excavation site. Below them, wooden structures sagged under decades of neglect, their roofs partially collapsed, windows staring like empty eye sockets across the tundra. "The village elder agreed to meet us," Claire shouted over the engine noise, checking her watch. The military had given them 48 hours before the artifact would be transported to Norilsk. If anyone knows local history about the site, it would be him. Voronov nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The separation from the artifact had not stopped the memory infiltration. That morning, he'd written a grocery list in perfect Evenki, a language he'd never studied. They landed on the village outskirts, the snow swirling around them as they made their way to a weather-beaten structure that had once been the community center. Inside, a lone figure waited. Nikolai Vetrov, 94 years old, his face a topographical map of lived experience. "You've disturbed it," the old man said without preamble, his English startlingly clear. "The thing that prefers to be ice." Claire exchanged glances with Voronov. They hadn't mentioned the artifact. "We found something in the permafrost," Voronov said carefully. "A bronze device with unusual properties." Nikolai's laugh was dry as ancient paper. "You found nothing. It found you." He gestured toward a wooden table covered with yellowed papers. "My grandfather was guide for the 1901 expedition, the one no history book mentions." Claire moved to the table. Among the documents lay a journal bound in cracked leather, the pages brittle with age. The handwritten Cyrillic script identified it as belonging to Anton Dvornikov, dated 1943. "Another who heard the call," Nikolai explained. "He came searching for what the 1901 team discovered. Said he was hearing voices from the future after finding a living timepiece in the ice." Claire translated portions of the journal aloud. Dvornikov described excavating a shaft identical to the one they'd found, discovering bronze fragments that whispered memories not his own. The entries grew increasingly disjointed, culminating in a final page where a single phrase was written in what appeared to be dried blood. "Ne smotri otrazhenie," don't look at the reflection. Dvornikov was found wandering the tundra, Nikolai said. He'd gouged out his own eyes. The implications sent a chill through Voronov that had nothing to do with the Siberian winter. "The artifact we found, it was whole, undamaged. It repairs itself," Nikolai said simply, "when it finds the right vessels." That night in their temporary quarters, Claire's sleep was invaded by visions that weren't hers. She witnessed ritual executions in ancient Mesopotamia, participated in astronomical observations from stone circles, felt the cold precision of mathematical equations that described consciousness as transferable energy. In each fragment, she occupied a different body, a different mind, yet all connected to the artifact. She woke gasping, finding Voronov already awake, his eyes reflecting moonlight in the darkness. "I saw it too," he said. "The circle of watchers." They weren't containing it, Claire realized, her voice steadier than she felt. They were selected by it. Vessels, like Nikolai said. Morning brought news that 2 military personnel assigned to guard the artifact had been found dead, their hands clutching their heads, eyes open and fixed on the ceiling. Autopsy revealed unusual brain activity, consistent with extreme information overload, as if they'd experienced too many memories simultaneously. Claire and Voronov returned to the research facility to find General Baranov reviewing security footage. The recording showed both guards approaching the artifact, standing motionless for exactly 137 seconds, then collapsing. "It's being transported to Norilsk tomorrow," Baranov stated flatly. "The Defense Ministry believes its properties could be strategically significant." In the isolation chamber, Claire conducted one final analysis of the artifact's inscriptions. Under ultraviolet light, a previously invisible line emerged beneath the surface patina. "All that is remembered remains alive." Voronov observed that the central gear rotated imperceptibly when left in absolute silence, as if responding to the absence of sound. They understood with growing certainty that they weren't examining an archaeological object. They were interacting with a memory-based life form that had been waiting, perhaps for millennia, to be rediscovered. And it wanted to continue existing, even if it needed to occupy the minds of those who found it. "We can't let them replicate it," Claire whispered, though no one else was present. "If they succeed..." Voronov nodded grimly. "Then the memories it contains would spread, like a contagion of consciousness." As they left the facility, neither noticed that the artifact's central gear had completed a full rotation, nor that the security cameras recorded them, leaving 7 minutes before they actually did. Claire sat alone in the dimly lit monitoring room, reviewing footage of the artifact in complete silence. 3 hours of observation had yielded nothing unusual, until frame 3427. She paused the recording, leaned forward, and felt her throat constrict. In that single frame, the polished bronze surface of the artifact showed a reflection that didn't match the laboratory. Instead of sterile white walls and monitoring equipment, the reflection revealed what appeared to be a stone chamber lit by oil lamps. But what caused her pulse to quicken was the figure reflected in the bronze, herself, viewed from behind, standing before the artifact. This version of Claire had grey-streaked hair and visible scars across her neck and shoulders, marks she didn't possess. "Found something," Voronov's voice made her flinch. He looked worse than yesterday, unshaven, eyes bloodshot, moving with the cautious precision of someone navigating unfamiliar terrain. "The artifact doesn't just record," Claire said, pointing to the anomalous frame. "It reflects possibilities, mental states that never occurred." Voronov studied the image without surprise, as if he'd been expecting it. "Bidirectional temporal interface," he murmured, using terminology that didn't exist in current scientific vocabulary. He caught himself, blinking rapidly. "I don't know why I said that." A spectral analysis of the bronze had revealed traces of lonsdaleite, a mineral formed only under the extreme pressure of meteorite impacts. The implications were troubling. The artifact's material composition wasn't entirely terrestrial. "I've been researching historical records," Claire said, spreading documents across the workstation. "The Solovetsky Monastery archives mention an object with similar properties. 15th century monks reported apparitions and mental confusion after contact with what they called the heart of divine memory. The Orthodox Church deemed the accounts heretical and suppressed them." Voronov's gaze drifted to the window, where military personnel were preparing a transport vehicle. "They're moving it tomorrow morning." "We can't let that happen." Claire's voice was low but firm. "Not until we understand what we're dealing with." Their conversation was interrupted by the facility's director. "You should see this," he said, handing them a report. Brain scans from the deceased guards show neural patterns identical to those emitted by the artifact, as if their minds were synchronized with it. Later that evening, Voronov stood motionless before his bathroom mirror. He'd been there for 27 minutes, though it felt like seconds to him. The face staring back wasn't entirely his own. Subtle differences in the eyes, the angle of the jaw, expressions that moved independently of his own. On his desk lay a handwritten note. "I saw myself dying yesterday." He had no memory of writing it. Claire found him an hour later, still standing before the mirror, pupils dilated to near-perfect circles despite the harsh lighting. When she touched his shoulder, he turned with mechanical precision. "Anunnaki," he said, using a voice that seemed to originate from somewhere behind his own. It was the name encrypted in the artifact, a name Claire had discovered but never shared with him. Back in the laboratory, Claire isolated the artifact in an electromagnetic chamber to contain its field. Using digital imaging, she attempted to decipher the remaining symbols. When she overlaid the patterns with historical records of unexplained disappearances, she discovered a disturbing correlation. Several of the encoded faces matched historical figures who had vanished under mysterious circumstances throughout recorded history. The artifact wasn't just a memory storage device, it was a conscious archive, collecting and preserving human consciousness across time. "It's not inanimate," she whispered to herself. "It's a collective." Voronov recovered gradually with no recollection of his dissociative episode. As they prepared for the artifact's transfer, he confided in Claire, "I'm beginning to think the artifact doesn't just contain memories. I think it harvests them." That night, Claire dreamed of standing in a circle with 11 others, their hands linked, surrounding the bronze disc. In the dream, they weren't containing the artifact, they were feeding it, willingly surrendering fragments of themselves to preserve something greater. She woke with a single thought crystallizing in her mind. What if the artifact hadn't been buried to keep something in, but to keep something out? The morning of the transfer arrived with an unexpected development. General Baranov appeared at their quarters, his expression grave. "There's been a complication," he announced. "The Council of Scientific Advisors has ordered an immediate cessation of all research. The artifact is to be returned to its original location and reburied." Claire and Voronov exchanged glances. "Why?" Claire asked. "Because," Baranov said, his voice unnaturally flat, "they've discovered identical artifacts at 3 other excavation sites across Siberia, all of them activated simultaneously yesterday at 1:37 p.m., all of them displaying the same sequence of symbols." He handed them a satellite image, and this appeared overnight. The photograph showed an enormous pattern melted into the Siberian permafrost, a perfect circle, 2 kilometers in diameter, with 12 evenly spaced points around its circumference. The excavation site was at its exact center. The helicopter banked sharply as Claire studied the pattern etched into the permafrost below. Perfect geometric precision on a scale that defied simple explanation. The circle's outline measured exactly 2,000 meters in diameter, with 12 equidistant markers that corresponded to nothing in modern or historical maps. "It's identical to the engraving on the artifact's base," she said, comparing the aerial photographs to her digital scans. "But how could it appear overnight? The ground is frozen solid." Voronov didn't answer. His gaze was fixed on the horizon, where the morning sun cast long shadows across the tundra. 3 military transport vehicles were already converging on the original excavation site, carrying personnel and equipment to rebury the artifact. "The other 3 artifacts," he said finally, "have they released any details?" General Baranov consulted his tablet. "Found at equidistant points around the circle, all approximately 5 meters below the permafrost, all exhibiting identical electromagnetic signatures." The implications were staggering. 4 artifacts positioned with mathematical precision, buried thousands of years ago, all activating simultaneously when the first was discovered. It wasn't random, it was a system. Back at the research facility, Claire isolated the original artifact in an electromagnetic chamber lined with signal-dampening material. Using digital enhancement algorithms, she deciphered more of the engraved symbols. "These aren't just decorative patterns," she explained to the assembled team. "They're a catalogue of human faces, repeated in circular patterns." She overlaid the scans with historical records of unexplained disappearances. The correlation was unmistakable. Dozens of faces matched historical figures who had vanished without explanation throughout recorded history. "The oldest date back to ancient Sumer," she continued. "The most recent—" She hesitated, then displayed an image from 1943, Anton Dvornikov, the explorer whose journal they'd found in Sindasko. It's not just storing information, Voronov said. It's collecting specific people. Or their consciousness, Claire added quietly. That afternoon, against explicit orders, they requisitioned a vehicle and drove to the Solovetsky Monastery archives. The ancient stone structure stood in stark contrast to the brutal functionality of the research facility, centuries of history embedded in its walls. The archive keeper, an elderly man with eyes clouded by cataracts, led them to a sealed crypt beneath the main chapel. The chamber hadn't been opened in decades, its contents deemed heretical by religious authorities and dangerous by Soviet officials. Inside, protected by layers of lead and silver, materials known for their electromagnetic shielding properties, lay a partial replica of the artifact. The inscriptions were in Cyrillic, dating to the 15th century, so that no one remembers that which never happened. The monks understood, the archive keeper said, his voice barely above a whisper. The object holds the echoes of lost souls. They built this chamber to contain a fragment that broke free from the main device. How does it function? Claire asked. It doesn't function, it persists. The old man's clouded eyes seemed to focus somewhere beyond the physical room. The only way to stop it is to break the chain of remembrance. No one can know it exists. As they left the monastery, Voronov noticed military vehicles approaching from the south. They're tracking us, he said, his voice unnaturally calm. They don't want us interfering with the reburial. We can't let them put it back, Claire said. Not without understanding what happens if all 4 artifacts are activated simultaneously. Voronov nodded, though something in his expression had changed, a subtle shift in the muscles around his eyes, as if someone else were looking out through them. I agree, he said. We need to secure the artifact first. Their return to the facility was met with armed guards and explicit orders. The artifact would be transported to the original excavation site at dawn. All research data was to be surrendered immediately. The project was officially terminated. Claire managed to copy critical files to a secure drive before the systems were locked down. In her quarters that night, she reviewed the final translations from the artifact's surface. One phrase appeared repeatedly across different sections. The vessel remembers, the circle preserves. She was cross-referencing this with Dvornikov's journal when an alarm blared through the facility. Security breach in the containment lab. When she arrived, 2 guards lay unconscious outside the sealed door. Inside, Voronov stood before the electromagnetic chamber, his hands pressed against the glass, staring at the artifact with an expression of perfect recognition. What are you doing? Claire demanded, reaching for the emergency shutdown. Voronov turned, his movements fluid, yet somehow wrong, like a marionette controlled by unpracticed hands. The artifact isn't going back into the ice, he said, his voice layered with unfamiliar cadences. And neither am I. Snow fell in silent sheets across the abandoned research station 50 kilometers north of the excavation site. Claire had disabled the vehicle's tracking system after their escape from the facility, though she suspected it wouldn't delay pursuit for long. Through the frosted windows, she observed Voronov, or whatever now occupied his consciousness, methodically arranging equipment they'd stolen during their hasty departure. You need to fight it, she said, keeping her distance. The artifact sat between them on a makeshift stand, its bronze surface gleaming despite the dim light. Whatever is happening to you, Mikhail, you can resist. His movements paused, head tilting at an unnatural angle. Mikhail is still here, he replied, his voice fluctuating between familiar tones and something ancient. But he's not alone anymore. None of us are ever truly alone. Claire had managed to inject him with a mild sedative during their flight from the facility, enough to render him temporarily compliant without losing consciousness. She needed answers more than she needed him incapacitated. Who are you? She demanded. His lips formed a smile that didn't reach his eyes. I am many. We are the remembered. His gaze dropped to the artifact. This vessel has carried us for 13 millennia. It requires a living anchor to be properly sealed again. Claire's scientific training battled with the impossible reality before her. Like Anton Dvornikov, she said, connecting fragments of understanding. That's why his name appeared in the artifact. He became part of it. He gave himself to preservation, Voronov confirmed, as others before him. It is the price of maintaining the integrity of forgetting. Outside, the wind howled across the Siberian wasteland. They had perhaps 6 hours before military search teams located them. Claire needed a plan, not just to contain whatever consciousness had infiltrated Voronov, but to understand what would happen if all 4 artifacts were reunited at the excavation site. The circle in the permafrost, she pressed. What does it mean? It is a boundary, Voronov replied. A perimeter of containment. When the 4 vessels are positioned correctly, they create a stable field that prevents leakage. Leakage of what? Memory. Consciousness. Time. His eyes unfocused momentarily. The ancients discovered that consciousness could be preserved beyond death. They built devices to capture it, to store it like grain against some future famine of the mind, but they didn't understand what they were collecting until it was too late. Using rudimentary tools found in the abandoned station, they began preparing for the journey back to the excavation site. Claire's plan was desperate, but clear. They would return the artifact to its original location, but on their terms, understanding its purpose rather than blindly following military directives. The location has a unique geological composition, she realized, reviewing seismic data on her tablet. A natural formation that emits a frequency almost identical to the artifacts. It's like a dampening field. Yes, Voronov nodded. The ancients didn't choose the burial site randomly. They found a place where natural forces could contain what they'd created. They constructed a crude electromagnetic cage based on ancient diagrams Claire had translated, designing it to hold the artifact during transport. As they worked, Voronov's condition deteriorated. His body trembled violently, eyes rolling back as he muttered disconnected dates, names, and languages. "They're inside me," he gasped during a moment of lucidity. Thousands of them, fragments of lives, incomplete memories, all struggling to remain remembered. The military would be expecting them to flee, not return to the excavation site. It was their only advantage. As dawn approached, Claire loaded their equipment into the vehicle. Voronov stared at his reflection in a broken window, his features shifting subtly, as if multiple faces were superimposed on his own. "You can't leave the artifact," she said, understanding finally. "Can you?" "Not anymore," he admitted. "I am its anchor now, as it is mine. We're connected." Claire took his cold hand in hers, feeling the tremors that ran through his body. "Then we'll return together." Voronov smiled with genuine warmth for the first time in days. "Memories are like mirrors, Claire. Sometimes they break." The artifact pulsed once with internal light, then fell silent. In that moment, Claire understood what they were facing. Not just the containment of an ancient device, but the preservation of something far more fragile, the boundary between individual consciousness and a collective repository of human experience that was never meant to be awakened. As they prepared to depart, Voronov looked toward the horizon where the first pale light of morning illuminated the endless white landscape. "What if we're wrong?" he asked, his voice momentarily his own. "What if returning it makes things worse?" Claire had no answer. She only knew that the alternative, allowing the military to experiment with technology they couldn't possibly understand, carried consequences too severe to contemplate. 6 months after Siberia, Claire stood at her office window in Cambridge, watching students cross the courtyard below. The university had welcomed her back without questions. The official record showed she'd been consulting on a routine archaeological assessment, nothing more. There had been no bronze artifact, no circle in the permafrost, no missing research partner. She turned to her desk, where stacks of corrupted files, blank emails, and empty recordings represented her futile attempts to document what had happened. The media had reported an inconclusive excavation error in Siberia. No mention of the artifact, no remembrance of Voronov. Even his academic records had vanished, as if he'd never existed. Only in her mind did the memories persist, growing sharper rather than fading with time. The military convoy intercepting them 5 kilometers from the excavation site. The artifact's bronze surface growing warm as they approached the circular pattern etched in the permafrost. Voronov's body convulsing as he clutched the device, refusing to release it even as soldiers surrounded them. "It needs to be buried with a living anchor," he had told her. Then, with unexpected clarity, "Just as Dvornikov did before me." Her security clearance had been revoked immediately. She was sedated for the flight back to England, waking with a diplomatic warning. Speak of the incident, and charges of espionage would follow. But they couldn't erase what she had seen. Voronov walking into the excavation shaft, still clutching the artifact, his eyes meeting hers one final time before the entrance collapsed behind him. The official report claimed a structural failure. No body was recovered, no mention was made of the artifact. Claire methodically organized her research into what she now called the Ice Archive, a manuscript documenting everything from their initial discovery to the final moments at the excavation site. The academic community would dismiss it as fiction, of course. That was safer for everyone. 3 days later, an envelope arrived containing a visitor's pass to the British Museum's special exhibition, Unidentified Artifacts of Historical Significance. Claire hadn't applied for such a pass. The handwriting on the envelope matched no one she knew. The exhibition hall was nearly empty when she arrived. Display cases contained objects of uncertain origin, fragments of mechanisms, tablets with undeciphered scripts, metal components from impossible technologies. In the final case, a small bronze fragment bore an inscription that appeared illegible to most visitors, but Claire recognized it instantly. It matched the artifact they'd found in Siberia, though the museum labeled it simply as uncatalogued item from the Assyrian collection. She approached a curator, attempting to explain the fragment's significance, but the woman stared through her as if she weren't speaking at all. Other visitors passed by, their eyes sliding over the display without registering its contents. Only a young boy, perhaps 7 years old, seemed to notice the fragment. He pressed his face against the glass, studying it with unusual intensity, before turning to Claire with an expression far too knowing for his age. "He still remembers you," the child said, then rejoined his oblivious parents. That evening, Claire completed her manuscript. The final page contained coordinates for the Siberian site and a warning. Some memories should remain frozen. She sealed it in a waterproof container and arranged for its storage in the university archives with instructions that it remain unopened for 50 years. Standing before her bathroom mirror, she studied her reflection with clinical detachment. For a split second, the face looking back shifted, a subtle rearrangement of features that suggested someone else was observing her through the glass. She turned to check the security camera she'd installed after returning from Russia. The footage showed her standing motionless for 7 minutes, lips moving in what appeared to be Sumerian, though she had no recollection of speaking. The screen flickered and went black. Claire returned to her desk and opened the manuscript one last time, adding a final sentence. What if forgetting isn't failure, but protection? What if remembering isn't preservation, but contagion? As snow began to fall outside her window, she noticed a reflection in her computer screen. Not her own face, but Voronov's, watching her with eyes that contained multitudes. When she turned, there was only empty space. But in that moment of recognition, she understood that some boundaries are not meant to be crossed, that memory itself can be a vessel, that the line between preservation and contamination is thinner than anyone could imagine, and that she would never truly be alone again.